sympathy, for empathy, for all those perspectives, I'm going to be speaking about an event that happened 30 years ago. And I was 20 years old. I was in college attending the Gregory Mull trial. First of all, I'd like to ask, before you all came to this panel, how many of you were familiar with the case of Church Universal and Triumphant versus Gregory Mull? Okay, so maybe about half the room. How many actually attended the trial? So we have one person, and thank you, you can keep me honest, so that makes two of us who were there. I was 20 years old, so if it was 30 years ago, I think you all know how old I am. So I'm going to do my best to walk you through it and explain why I think it maintains some relevance for today. This happened in 1986. It was a time when U.S. courts were open to testimony about coercive persuasion, something they may not be as open to today. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of Robert Lifton and of Edgar Schein. And we have two terms which were thrown around quite a bit at the trial: thought reform and coercive persuasion. So coercive persuasion is in the title of our panel today. I'm aware that this word, or this term, has connotations in different contexts. As Edgar Schein, who studied prisoners of war, coined the term, and then as it was later taken up and developed by Margaret Singer, an expert witness at the trial, as well as the sociologist Richard Offshee, who wrote about it also. So we know that terms change meaning over time. There is a sense in which I believe that the coercive persuasion in the Edgar Schein sense may be different from the coercive persuasion in the Richard Offshee sense, for example. And so I'm asking you to sort of look at the trial evidence, look at the events we'll be talking about through and compare them to the different definitions of coercive persuasion. Now, of course, Lifton, and the reason I've put this quote here is it says, how can we tell? Lifton, he tried to use his work that he'd done with Chinese thought reform techniques, and he tried to apply it to the larger world. However, he was one of the first to state, and we've all heard sort of his, 8 characteristics of a thought reform program. He notes that these characteristics are present in many educational and religious institutions. And so it's not often known about Lifton's work is that he thought it was very important. He believed that there was sort of a bright line that could be drawn between sort of negative thought reform and then sort of positive education. But he even does write in his book that some people who have been in thought reform programs have experienced transcendence, but he believes the difference is the goal of the program. So in a sense, we're judging what was the goal of this educational, manipulative type of program. So I'm sure we'll have plenty of time in the questions and answers to talk about that, but I would just ask you to think when you hear about a cult or a judgment against a cult, to think about looking at the individual circumstances, not only, and this is where I would also bring in Lifton and Schein, they believed that it was important to look at the characteristics of the individual person and not just of the group. In fact, totalism requires that you have not only these conditions of a totalist environment, but you also have within the person, him or herself. And that is why, in fact, the Chinese thought reform program was not terribly successful. There were only a couple of people that Lifton studied who actually went on to espouse communist beliefs after the program was lifted. So we're going to talk a little bit about Gregory Mull, how he came to join Church Universal and Triumphant, and sort of enter legal history. Margaret Singer's definition of a cult. How does one say whether this applies to Church Universal and Triumphant? New religions almost always have a self-appointed leader. My mother would sometimes often say, don't venerate me, venerate the masters, or venerate God, venerate your own higher self. But yet people saw, people kneeling to her, people, giving her flowers, treating her with a lot of reverence. So there was a sense that she was worshipped. the choice about whether there was a double set of ethics, whether the group was elitist, you know, that could be said about many groups. I think that even the totalistic aspect, this word is often used about religions, and you've got examples in the military and the Catholic orders where you do have rules governing almost all aspects of life. So I don't really think this definition works that well for Church Universal and Triumphant, but there is no question that it was a small new religion that felt persecuted, that had high tension, different degrees of tension with the surrounding society. I mean, many of the church members worked in normal jobs and supported themselves, and the vast, vast majority. So it's difficult to say, but this is the definition that was used at the trial. Margaret Singer, of course, had her own program that she was talking about, the systematic manipulation of social and psychological influence, which was a controversial theory that, is, in my understanding, has not really been accepted or tested. But the sense of her theory was that these groups, and it could be not necessarily a religious group, it could be a business group, would perhaps use a certain technology that would elicit some kind of instantaneous transformation in a person so that they could not think for themselves. And the reason why she felt that this applied to Church Universal and Triumphant was she felt that the group was into survivalism and they would kill to clear the planet, which is something she said, which that's one of the things she said, which had no basis in reality. I mean, church people, regardless of the fact that some of them later bought weapons, did not have a sense that they needed to kill off people. The weapons that were bought because they were looking at a possible scenario of, you know, anarchy, nuclear war, wanting to protect their families, that kind of thing. But there was never a thought that they were going to go out and start some revolution, like, you know, the Manson group or anything like that. So, as I've said, groups are different from each other. My mother's group was seen by many people as helpful, and I'm in touch with many former members who still practice and still use the techniques that they learned in the church. So it's been stated that it's really sort of impossible to distinguish the Margaret Singer brand of coercive persuasion from conventional forms of social influence. I don't really have time to evaluate all of that, but if anyone has questions, I'm happy to talk about it. At Summit University, which was this, you know, sort of indoctrination program that Gregory attended for 6 months of his life, there was a fair amount of control of the environment. People were asked to leave the past behind and not talk to the, you know, former friends for that time period, not for their entire lives. Gregory was free to call his daughter during his time in the program. It was supposed to be seen as sort of a retreat setting. But there certainly was, you know, it was certainly intense. There were certainly dietary restrictions and other things. I think that Gregory was always aware of that this was a church, that this was a religion that he was participating in. I don't think there was the kind of deception like, oh, you think this is a, you know, a vegetarian dinner and suddenly you're in a new religion. But you know, there were definitely instances, and my mother being, you know, the sole recognized leader of the group, could be authoritarian with people, and there were, you know, meetings played at the trial that sound pretty horrendous to an untrained ear. You know, how could someone talk to someone like this? And my mother thought she was doing it in, you know, out of love or out of being her role, acting her role as a guru. But that's really for someone else to judge. So at the trial, it was sort of stated that part of the means of accomplishing coercive persuasion, and you've probably heard about the use of hypnosis and the role that hypnosis may play in coercive persuasion. So it was said that the decrees, which you heard, the chanting, would cause Gregory Mull to be placed into a state where he would basically do whatever Elizabeth Clare Prophet told him to do, that he would not have his own free will, that especially if he had a sword waved around his head and he were shouted at, which is what one of our rituals did, that would put him, that would cause him to, would be a shock, constitute a shock induction, which would cause him to be unable to mount any opposition, and that he would give anything that was asked. So we'll talk as part of the model when we look at some of the other evidence that was presented. But it was alleged that this sort of chakra image here was a trance induction symbol, that if it was waved in front of someone's face, that it could cause them to enter into a trance. Since many people who were in the group continued to use the decrees after leaving, I find this to be one of the most difficult to believe aspects of the testimony. But at least, I will say, at least 15% of the testimony in the trial related to decrees and what they could do to people. So this probably would not have been allowed today. If you think about why all the testimony about decrees, it's you either believe that these decrees work, that they cause Gregory harm, or there might be this notion that they cause hypnosis, or the third and the only that I can see legitimate reason for having testimony about decrees is that the fact of knowing that people were decreeing against him or against his energy, there was a question about that, would cause him emotional distress. And I could see that. Right? I think people have decreed against me since I left. My other former members feel that they've been decreed against. I haven't noticed any bad effects that I can think of, but I do think that decrees can polarize people. If you're sort of decreeing about somebody's energy instead of going and talking to them, things can become more polarized. So in that sense, I think the church should sort of disavow this notion of decreeing against people's energy, but people probably still do it. It was a practice. So the church had two expert witnesses, or had several expert witnesses. Two of them, Robert Moore and Gordon Melton, had visited the church and viewed its recruitment practices, viewed decrees, and they had a little bit of a different view than Margaret Singer. Now Margaret Singer, I will note, had not read any of Mr. Mull's letters. She simply was basing her evaluation of him on his, what you would call his post-group appearance. So the way he appeared to her, I believe in 1984 and 1985 when she interviewed him, that was how she formed her evaluation that he had been permanently psychologically disabled by the church. My view is that people had a lot of different experiences with the church. Robert Moore attended more than 100 decree sessions. He felt that they did not cause people to be dependent. He thought that one man's thought reform is another man's Christian education. Gordon Melton talked about the diets and the chanting, and he felt that these are all just simply alternative lifestyle choices. They don't necessarily cause thought reform simply because they don't conform to traditional ideas about what a religion should look like. Okay. So is there another way to evaluate the lifestyle? Is there another way to evaluate the evidence presented at the trial? Now, many people, when they see someone who's in a cult writing like sort of a glowing testimonial, this is a wonderful place, I love it here, the food's great, it sounds like somebody told them to write the letter, right? And Gregory wrote many letters at the trial. They were presented in evidence. In the past, people have put the trial transcript online, but the letters were not with them. The letters are exhibits. And I happen to know, because I spoke with the jury foreman after the trial, that the letters were an important part of her decision. She was actually the only member of the jury that did not support the verdict that the church should have been liable. So she actually thought, but she was only one person out of 12. But in any case, there's several ways to evaluate these letters. You could say, well, the church told us people to write them, right? Church, somebody was standing there telling Gregory what to write. He claimed that this letter he wrote because everyone was told to write letters. When I was there, when there were articles that were coming out about the church, it was my feeling that people were upset because they felt they were being misrepresented, and they were basically told, you should feel free to write letters if you want to. And hundreds of church members did write letters independently, and many of them were published. So the second way to evaluate the letters is that they were somehow engendered from this milieu of coercive persuasion, that Gregory was writing within this indoctrination program, so he was using the church language and jargon, and he was trying to present himself in a positive light to the church leaders. And you could certainly see some of that in some of the other letters. He wanted to be employed by the church. The third way to look at the letters is that they show an interactive relationship. So if someone's being active, they are actively negotiating. And that's the way that the sociologist James Richardson looked at these letters. He felt that these letters were rational, that they showed straightforward negotiation, and that they also showed that Mr. Mull was active. I have copies of the letters. I'm happy to share them with anyone who's interested. I'm planning to post them on my website along with a copy of the trial transcript at some point in the future, as well as my evaluation. But you do see some negotiation. In 1975, he threatens he's going to leave the church if he doesn't get an apology. That, to me, is not the sign of someone who is abject and dependent. He offers to volunteer for the church. He asks to work for the church, too, but then he later also asks to volunteer. He tells his ex-wife that he has made the decision himself to divorce her. He talks about the money being a loan. And he makes different proposals to the church about how to deal with the $37,000. Now, I don't have time to go into that, but I do think that it's worth taking another look at. And honestly, I think it's healthy that ICSA is looking at this trial. I think it's a sign of maturity in a group when you're willing to take a nuanced look at people you may have considered saints and also people you've considered demons. And I think for myself, I try to do that, and I think many people have sort of reassessed. We don't really know exactly what Gregory was like before he joined the church. However, we do know that he was familiar with a lot of these ideas that Kathleen was talking about, these sort of esoteric ideas, reincarnation, belief in ascended masters. All these things were things that he was believed in before he found the church. So an active conversion model of Gregory's involvement would be that he was really looking for a place where he could learn more about these topics, and he actually testified that he enjoyed and appreciated the strictness of the lifestyle at the church. And this was in 1986 he testified this. This was how he felt originally. This just shows that he's now in November of 1980, he's completely changed his view of the church, and now it's sort of an evil organization. I have an alternative theory for why Gregory became so upset with the church and why he really couldn't let it go, why he couldn't get back with his life. I mean, I think there's no question that it was damaging to him to go through this experience of leaving the church and losing the respect of people that he had known for a long time. I think also that even while he was in the church, there were signs, and he does write in his letters complaining of headaches and pains and things like that, that his physical health may well have been deteriorating even while he was on staff. I think that he also came into contact with former members who talked about hypocrisy of the leaders, and I think that had a deep and profound impact on him. I don't necessarily think that it was relevant to the issues in the trial, but the allegations of my mother's sexual hypocrisy, the fact that she had had an extramarital affair while my father was alive with my stepfather, Randall King, who later became her third husband, that knowledge was damaging and difficult for Gregory to accept and understand. I think that is part of what fueled his campaign, his anger, his desire to go around and interview former members, and then again, just simply losing his standing. So I think that taking a second look at this event is a good idea for researchers. I think it suggests some avenues for future research. Right now is a period when many of the groups that were studied back in the 80s now have people who had been in them for 30 years. Much of the academic research that was done on the long-term effects of involvement in a group was done for people who had been involved for 6 months to 2 years. And it was believed that people would sort of have conversion careers, and they would join a group and then they would leave, and that these groups didn't have any long-term effects. I think that for many of the people that I know who've been in groups for up to 30 years, and then suddenly either the group isn't there anymore, or they're kicked out with a couple $1,000s, that's got a profound effect on someone that is not going to go away in a year or two. So I think there is room for additional research to be done on people who've had a very long-term involvement. I think that Gregory Mull's case shows the importance of evaluating the individual circumstance and the experience, and not simply trying to stamp all cult experience with the same cookie cutter. And just simply to maintain a little bit more open-mindedness, a little bit more nuance about how we approach involvement, and sort of maybe a little bit of empathy for all sides, and people who are in groups and people who have left them. So that is all. Thank you.